you hear me? All right, great. So I'm Byron Auguste, and I feel a little bit like, you know, when stand-up comedians, before they have a big concert, they play the clubs, you know, to test out their new material. So that's a little bit what this is like right now, which is great because I think the material, actually, you need to engage with it a little bit. I'll tell you, I am the co-founder and managing director of a social enterprise called Opportunity at Work, started about a year ago. Prior to that, I had 20 years in business. I was a director at McKinsey and 2 years in the White House, where I was deputy director of the National Economic Council. I would say I had about the same number of heartbeats cumulatively in the 2 jobs. So it was quite an intense thing in the White House. But like the last few years, I started following a thread that started a bit with K-12 education and then went into higher education and then into the workforce. And I found this guy, Karan Chopra, who's just walking in, my co-founder. We launched the social venture with a goal, sort of the tagline, Rewire the labor market, and actually a goal over the next 10 years to enable at least 1 million more Americans to work and earn to their full potential. And we believe that's possible, and more than that, we think that that is actually, think of that as a market scale proof of concept, 1 million people. Because there's in fact about 80 million people in the United States, and more every day, that are being ill-served by our labor market and need the rewiring. So what I want to do in the next few minutes is to just start with the stuff we see and are curious about, pull the thread through to like what seems to be going wrong, tell you just a little bit about the solution we're pursuing in Opportunity at Work and Tech Hire, but then pull back the lens again and to talk about why this matters, and why, in fact, I think it matters more than any other problem we could tackle. So, here we go. So, if any of you sort of follow the economic news, you'll see a version of this chart like every month. So for the last 6 years, there's been continuous job creation in the United States. But if you're paying attention, you'll notice that that hasn't made everybody feel peachy keen. Like apparently, you know, we're all still very glum about it. And that might have something to do with the fact that wages for the average household basically are roughly where they were 17 years ago. So for almost a generation, the median American household has not had a raise. So that does get people grumpy, and I think that might have something to do with the fact that, you know, people talk about jobs being created, they don't see it. Or rather, they actually can see jobs being created, and they'll say, yeah, I see a lot of people getting jobs, but I don't see a lot of people getting ahead. Okay, but why is this the case? I mean, why does this happen? And I think when you look at it, because US productivity, of course, could have shown another chart. I mean, average productivity growth, sort of the output, the value of output per worker has been rising, right? But you still have that flatlining. But part of what's happening is that when you add it up, you've got about half the workforce that, given the way our labor market works today, are overlooked, are underutilized, and they're stuck. And that's not accidental. That's sort of, it's not intentional, but it's systematic. So if you think about the almost 40 million Americans who did go to college but didn't graduate, and the value of their education, they earn much closer to high school graduates than to college graduates. They don't have the credential. If you think about people who have worked, who have a lot of skills, but those skills need to be retooled, typically older workers in your 40s or 50s. For decades, like in the 1980s, if you changed jobs in your 40s, on average, you got a significant salary increase. Today, if you change jobs in your 40s, on average, you get a significant salary decrease. It's flipped. That transition's not being made well. Caregivers, you're taking care of your kids for 15 years, you want to get back in the workforce. You might have an engineering degree, and you're being offered folding sweaters at the Gap. Right? You can talk about veterans, you can talk about young people who are out of work, long-term unemployed workers, just everybody who learns on the job, for one thing, which is where most people learn. If they don't have the associated credential, that might be fine at their current company, but if they try to make a move, they've got a problem. So, why is this happening? And this is important to understand that there are some fundamental issues here. This is not kind of a cyclical thing. First of all, do you select or do you invest? If you are an employer, you want the best person in the role who's sort of doing a good job. Now, there's a couple ways to get there, to oversimplify it. You can go find a person like that who's already been trained, who's already experienced, and you can poach them. Or you can find a person with the potential to be like that, right? And you can hire them, and you can train them, and you can invest in them, right? And get them there. Okay, turns out that 30 years ago, most employers went out and found the person. Half of hiring was entry-level hiring, and the expectation is you train and develop someone into the person you wanted them to be on the job, right? But today, only 6% of hiring is entry-level hiring. 6%. So the hiring now is I want someone with 8 years of experience in these specific database languages and this sort of progression and with these degrees and whatnot, right? So, but we don't have, we have a lot of great technology, but we don't have time machines. So if the job description that we put together in 10 days says what someone has to have been doing for the last 10 years, 20 years of their life, well, that's not even a demand signal. That's a search algorithm. You either have it or you don't. So that last slide of the half the market that's excluded, that's how they're excluded. By the way, the same thing applies to some degree in higher education, right? Like what is the, you can select someone who's got the most, who's the most accomplished, right, through your selection intake, or you can teach them something, right, and actually add value. But it's the same thing for employers. This is fundamental. Today, employers are poaching out the front door, they're being poached out the back door, and then they're wondering why there's a skills gap. All right. Second, coordination, missing signals, and risk. All right. These are traffic lights. They're actually very, very useful things to have in a city. And the first thing you think about them is they stop you from getting into accidents. They make you safer. But the interesting thing about traffic lights is they also allow you to drive faster on average. Why? Because you're not worried about crashing into something all the time, right? So actually having a standard set of signals. When I come and I see it's a green light, I not only know it's a green light, I also know without looking that there's a red light over here and a red light over here, right? So I can go through. Now, so signals matter a lot. Now in the job market, we've just talked about the fact that actually the signals that employers are sending are not, here's what skills you have to master. The typical, it's not, here's what you have to be able to do, to what standard, in what context. That would be a signal that would be clear and that we could work towards, like an individual, right? But if it's not that, if the signals are all about pedigree, or indeed they are entirely unclear, as they often are, and we might be one of the half of the labor market that lacks the social networks, right, and the connections that allow us to navigate this extremely confusing system, well then, not only might we do the wrong thing, but in addition, we are going to be very risk averse because we don't know what the right thing is to do, right? So you've got half the labor market that's in a position that cannot answer the question, if I work really hard at X to learn Y, I could get to job Z. They don't know. So they might see ads, they might see billboards, whatever. They're going to try something because everyone is trying to get ahead, but they don't have the signals to do it. So there's a big coordination failure. And on the employer side, there is too, right? Because, of course, an employer can't pre-commit to saying, oh, if you have the skill level, I will hire you. But in the aggregate, we need a system where employers on the whole can commit to say, hey, if you have the skill level, right, you'll get hired. And if you have that, then you can flip the script, and then individuals can see, oh, right, it's a yellow light, I need more skills. It's a green light, I can go through, let's do it, right? That's missing entirely in our market, or worse than missing, and sometimes it's backwards. And then finally, return, ROE, return on equity in the context of invested capital in companies, or return on effort from the standpoint of the individual. Right now, we have a tremendous infrastructure that helps companies make the very complicated set of decisions that lead to what's their return on equity, right? And so at the end, you see that in their stock price and in the value to their shareholders. That's the net result, right? But a tremendous amount goes into that and thinking how to put it all together. And by the way, there's a lot of resources to do that too. But what about individuals, right? Actually, if you think about the labor market, right? Think about everything that has gone into the skills you have today, right? Not only your education, your parenting, your formal education, your parenting, your mentoring, your experiences, your internships, all that, like all the choices you make, others make, et cetera, on the job, et cetera. Individuals don't have the clarity or the support or the guidance. Well, fortunate ones do, right? But actually, not only unfortunate, but the average ones do not. And so we're going to get back to this, but this is an important point. So these are the fundamentals to keep in mind as you think about what's going wrong. And now some of the specifics of the changes. So you hear a lot about a shortage of college graduates, and I actually think it's true in the sense that the skills and competencies that are developed in a good college education are absolutely in greater demand. You know, critical thinking, clear communications, et cetera, and they will continue to be, as well as technical skills that you might gain at that level. So that's true, but on the other hand, in the labor market itself, we've made credentials in the bachelor's degree more of a barrier than a bridge, right? So it's gone from being like a helpful signal to now a barrier. So to take an example, and our colleagues from Burning Glass are here, only 20% of administrative assistants, secretaries, have bachelor's degrees. But 2/3 of the new job postings for secretaries require a bachelor's degree to apply. So 80% of today's secretaries can't apply for 2/3 of the jobs in their own field unless they go back to college. Okay, so think about that when you think about allocation of capital and people's time. Which relates, I'm just going to jump across to the far end, this job openings versus job mobility. The job mobility problem right now, everybody thinks, people think everyone's job hopping, like millennials are job hopping. That's not true. Actually, voluntary job mobility, where you quit your job to get a better job, is down 25% since the year 2000. And that's like the equivalent of a startup for the labor market. It's when you feel confident, right? It's say, hey, I can do better. Because remember, this is not just a market for helping employers. This is a market for helping people realize their full potential. And in fact, back to that wage chart, in a normal economy, half of all wage increases come from someone quitting their job to get a better job, right? They maybe studied, they practiced, they're ready to go. So that is, but there's a lot less of that happening. And so you get to this net situation where we're actually at all-time high, give or take, on job openings, and we're at a 40-year low on what we consider the normal working age people, the percentage of them that are actually in the workforce. Okay, so this is a pretty badly functioning market at the end of the day because of those fundamentals, and it's sort of crept up on us in the last 30 years. It's really changed. That last thing there is this fire when ready recession. Is just to explain this. If you look at after World War II, there were the first 5 recessions after World War II, companies actually held on to as many of their workers as they could, right? They basically accepted lower profits. Remember, they had trained them. They had hired them straight out of high school or college or PhD programs or whatever, and they had trained them, right? So they hung on to them. Typically, they hung on to 2/3 of what you would have had to lay off, right, in order to keep your profits stable. But that changed over sort of 4 cycles. And in the last 2 recessions, basically 100% of the drop in demand companies dealt with by firing people. Okay, so relative to their old standards, so this last recession, 10 million more people than would have happened under the old model were put out of work, right? But those people still were subject, as they tried to get back to the labor market, to the same old biases of, if you're out of work for more than 6 months, right, that's a huge problem. Well, if you've just put 10 million people out of work, it's maybe less of a signal of their quality than of like the aggregate behavior. But again, this is, it's a collective action, the signals, right? What does that signal mean? Companies didn't adjust what that signal meant, even though their aggregate behavior massively changed what that signal actually should have meant, right? So, but no one is in charge of figuring this out, right? Like you hear a lot of people say, job creation is our #1 priority. You hear politicians say that. You hear businesses, Chamber of Commerce will say we're the job creators, et cetera. Spoiler alert, nobody is in charge It is nobody's job to create jobs, right? It's actually, that's true. It's a byproduct. Job creation, job quality, et cetera, is a byproduct of other objectives. The only person in this entire system that has the absolutely aligned incentives is the individual themselves. And that person has such limited knowledge. They're only going through it once, right? They can't see, 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times. They're just going through it once. And they are at the most risk, right? If a company has a bad hire, it does stink. I mean, it's a pain. Companies go to great lengths to avoid bad hires. But think about how much worse it is, how much riskier it is for an individual. What if you choose the wrong course of study, right? What if you start in the wrong company? What if you end up living in the wrong place for the field, right? You're 100% at risk. You've got no diversification. And you've also got no support, no guidance to speak of. So what should it look like? So Opportunity at Work, the social venture I mentioned, and I see our other co-founder, Tyra Mariani, has snuck in the back there. We think the way to go here is a three-part strategy to rewire. And I should say, you don't need to change the entire labor market this way. You need to get enough, though. At the margin, there needs to be a critical mass of the system working in this new way. And eventually, if we're right that it's going to be a more effective way, that share is going to grow over time, right? So number one, employers need to hire not based on pedigree, but based on ability, and specifically based on demonstrations of competence. So if you want to know, for example, if someone can code, don't look at their resume, don't look at their transcript, look at their code. It's on GitHub. And if it's not on GitHub, then they're being taught in the wrong way. Like if they're taking a program at college for community college or anywhere, and they're not being able to show those portfolios of work in a way that can be exposed, that's malpractice. And so you want to change that, which relates to the second one, which is the learning pathways. Right now, it is impossible to overstate how stratified learning pathway, education, higher education, training, all of that is. It's stratified by financial status, professional status, social networks. I mean, not only access to it, but even awareness of it is stratified in that way, which is, again, back to the chart about the half of our workforce, the 80 million Americans who are being shut out in this system and overlooked in this system. That's another reason why. So you need to have, but to make those pathways work, you need the employer hiring. So now if the employers have a critical mass of employers have said, hey, if you can get to this standard, that means you actually are qualified for that job. Now we don't have to throw the individual learning, the learning can be targeted at that, right? And you can know, like, when you actually get there. Do you get there or not? Have you leveled up? And because there's a critical mass, and what we're doing at Opportunity at Work is to create an employer network that makes this commitment. And then you can have training institutions, and indeed individuals themselves, since so many are self-taught, particularly in technology jobs, to follow these paths. And then finally, financing of learning. So because if you have those first two, first of all, there's a lot of people already who know how to do the job that can't even get an interview. But a lot of people have the aptitude but don't yet know how to do it. And learning can cost money. But what's the financing? Right now, we finance it either based on student loans, which is essentially sort of compliance-oriented. If you're eligible, we strap money to your back, send you out. Good luck. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Or there's private lending. That's FICO. The poorer you are, the more you pay, or the less access you have. We think you can actually do better. And to just give some examples of that, this woman, Lashana Lewis, you may have read, there was a story in, I think, Fast Company this week in this tech hire initiative that Opportunity at Work is working with in St. Louis, nonprofit Launch Code. Lashana knew how to code. She learned in high school. She had a year of college. Family troubles caused her to have to drop out of college. But she knew how to do this. This is not a training story. This is an access. For 10 years, she was working in call centers and as a bus driver, various jobs. She couldn't get an interview for a technology job, right? What happened here is essentially that she was identified. She came in for a meetup. She had a chance to show what she could do. She got a job at MasterCard. Actually, she recently got a promotion She's doing very well. We keep in touch, and it's a great story. And I know a lot of people like Lashana who can do this but are shut out. Even closer to home, learning pathways. These are my parents, circa 1970 in Detroit. And my dad at the time was a clerk, sort of a shipping clerk in a kosher food company. And he saw an ad to learn COBOL, the IBM mainframe language, 1970. So at the time, it was growing incredibly fast. And the ad basically said, hey, if you can learn COBOL, you can write your ticket. You can get a job. You know, it doesn't matter. You've worked in technology. You've worked in an office. It doesn't matter. You can get a job. So he took that shot. Turned out there's no reason to believe on the face of it that he was the person they were looking for. But it turned out he was great at it, and he loved it. And that was our family's trajectory into the middle class. But the thing is, here's what you need to master. I don't know if you can do it, but give it a shot if you think you can. That's what we mean. And then talent financing. So Alexander Hamilton, you may have heard of that guy. He just won an epic battle to stay on the $10 bill, which is great. But what you may not remember about his story is that he came to the United States on a scholarship. He was an orphan. He was completely unconnected. And he got a scholarship because he wrote this amazing letter to the editor about this epic storm in his home island. And people read it and said, what? This 15-year-old urchin has so much talent. And they put the money behind and to invest. So that was a bet not based on his ability to pay. It was not based on, for sure, not based on any kind of credentials or status or anything, and there was no program. But they bet on the talent. And we can do that today at scale in a modern way. So the financing can be based on indicators of potential. The repayment can be linked to outcomes. Critical in all of this is the network of employers that are going to hire. Because remember, if employers are still going to screen on pedigree, then financing based on talent and ability and potential is not going to work, right? You have to have employers being willing to hire based on demonstrated competencies for this whole thing to work. But if you do, you can also keep some of the training honest with some risk sharing too. And we can see that work. So we actually can get started rewiring the labor market. There's a lot of great business employer initiatives going on. There's some good public policy, but in the end, we think to turbocharge this, we need the combination of the inclusive approach of social enterprises, which is why we chose to do this the way we're doing it, but working really closely to and building the tech platforms. And one of the things that's amazing now, rewiring the market, that seems crazy. Well, think about Airbnb. Right? Think about eBay. Is it really more plausible that millions of strangers are now sleeping in bedrooms next to millions of other strangers, and that's all been worked out, how that works, the risk and all of that stuff? I think 10 years ago, we would have said it's way more likely that employers would be able to basically give people a chance based on what they can do, right? So the point is there is a technology, and if you think about open source, you think about so many things that now can scale. This is actually a problem that we can solve today together. So we're doing that in Tech Hire with 50 cities. These are the 50. There's 50 cities, states, and regions. There's 1,000 employers that have signed up now. There are, I think we may have a slide. Yeah, there we go. There are, as of a few months ago, so we've now got over 1,000 employers. We've got about 200 training institutions, all working according to this model, but focused on information technology occupations, because that's the place where you really can, today, you can see it. There's high value. Employers, you don't have to convince employers that they need to change because they can keep doing what they're doing, but they've got all these jobs they can't fill. You could focus that on Tech Hire, and it's actually been a very good proposition. It's relatively easy to assess, what you can do, and so that's the way we're going. And we consider this very much the thin end of the wedge because of all those fundamentals we talked about in the labor market. If you can get this started here and employers start working this way, we expect to see this expand into other skilled jobs. Because to finish the thought, the labor market is an $8.5 trillion market in the US. It is the market in which all investments in human capital are ultimately monetized and ultimately realized. Human capital is 4 to 5 times as large a part of the capital stock, the productive capital stock of the United States, as all the invested capital of all private sector entities. But unlike that invested capital, this 4 to 5 times more is completely unoptimized, it's completely unstructured. And if every economic era has an underutilized asset, whether it's farmland or factories, capital, that you realize, the next era can be the human capital era. And that underutilization, if Airbnb is worth $30 billion by optimizing unutilized bedrooms, what do you think is the value of the underutilized talent in this country and in this world? Just like in the industrial era, you had the Carnegies and the Rockefellers and all that. Nonprofits, for-profits, the amount of value to be created and the amount of opportunity to be created for people over the next years is immense. And I hope you'll all be a part of it. Thank you.